the Wild West. For over a century, it has been shown to us as a land of freedom, bravery, and adventure. A place where cowboys rode into the sunset, where sheriffs stood tall against evil, where justice always won. But what if I told you that was never the truth? Behind the myths lies a story America has tried to bury. The real Wild West was not heroic. It was brutal. It was savage. It was soaked in blood. This was an era where violence was daily life, a time when entire towns were born in chaos and died in silence, where lawmen and outlaws often looked exactly the same, and the line between justice and murder was nothing more than a bullet. Imagine a world with no rules, where every man carried a gun at his side, and the quickest hand determined who lived and who was left bleeding in the dust. Hollywood showed you the duel at high noon, two men facing off with honor. The reality? Most gunfights weren't noble. They were messy. They were sudden. A drunken argument, a cheating hand of cards, a glance that lasted too long, and within seconds, someone was dead. And beyond the saloons and dusty streets, a darker story unfolds. The story of those who lost everything. Native Americans slaughtered, their lands stolen, their villages burned. Men, women, and children massacred. Their voices silenced forever beneath the myth of progress. Railroads tore through sacred lands, greed devoured the frontier, and every mile of track, every gold mine, every new settlement came at the cost of blood. The West was not just violent, it was haunted. Abandoned ghost towns, where echoes of gunfire still seemed to ring. Hotels and saloons, where gamblers were shot dead, their spirits said to still walk the halls. Even today, visitors claim to feel the cold touch of the past in places where the blood once ran deep. This is the story you were never told. The bloody, chilling truth behind America's most famous myth. Outlaws whose names became legends because of the trails of bodies they left behind. Lawmen who were worshipped as heroes, but were often killers themselves, and ordinary men and women trapped in a world where survival meant making impossible choices. The Wild West wasn't about freedom, it wasn't about justice, it was about power, violence, and death, and tonight, we're going to uncover it all. The Wild West, where only two things truly mattered, the gun and the grave. For over 100 years, the story of the Wild West has been told the same way. Cowboys as noble heroes, sheriffs as guardians of justice, outlaws as daring villains who fought with honor. Hollywood gave us a West filled with dusty duels, dramatic showdowns, and brave men who stood for what was right. But the truth could not be further from that fantasy. Let's start with the cowboy, the icon of the American frontier. In movies, he's the lone rider, fearless, strong, and free. But in reality, cowboys were poor laborers. They worked long, brutal hours herding cattle across endless miles of desert and prairie. They weren't respected legends. They were often young men, many in their teens, paid barely enough to survive. Their days were filled with back-breaking work, storms, stampedes, disease, and the constant threat of death from accidents or attacks. And most cowboys, they weren't even white Americans. A large number were Mexican vaqueros, African Americans escaping slavery, and Native Americans forced into hard labor. The image of the white heroic cowboy is nothing more than a myth. Now let's look at the famous high noon duel. You've seen it in every Western movie. Two men standing tall in the middle of the street, staring each other down, waiting for the clock to strike 12. The truth? That almost never happened. Gunfights in the Wild West were rarely organized or noble. They weren't fair duels. They were sudden, chaotic, and brutal. Most shootouts happened in crowded saloons after nights of heavy drinking. They started over cheating at cards, stolen money, or insults thrown across the room. And the victims weren't always outlaws. Sometimes they were innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. Hollywood also gave us the sheriff, the brave lawmen who brought order to lawless towns. In reality, many sheriffs and marshals were corrupt, on the payroll of the very criminals they were supposed to be fighting. Some even ran protection rackets, turning a blind eye to gambling, prostitution, and smuggling, as long as they got their share. And when lawmen did act, it wasn't always for justice. They often acted for revenge, money, or political power. Heroes like Wyatt Earp, often glorified in legend, lived lives filled with gambling, corruption, and violence. They weren't spotless saviors. They were flawed men trying to survive in a brutal world. Even the towns themselves weren't what the movies promised. Hollywood gave us clean streets, cheerful saloons, and frontier charm. But the real boomtowns of the West were filthy, crowded, and dangerous. Streets were filled with mud, animal waste, and disease. Saloons weren't lively dance halls. They were dens of violence, gambling, and prostitution. For every man chasing the American dream, there were 10 more waiting to rob him, cheat him, or kill him. In towns like Deadwood, Dodge City, and Tombstone, murder rates were among the highest in the country. To walk the streets at night was to risk never coming back. And yet, the myth persisted. Writers in the late 1800s began romanticizing the West, turning ruthless killers into noble outlaws. Newspapers exaggerated every story to sell more copies. And later, Hollywood transformed that myth into legend, with John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, and countless westerns rewriting history as a tale of honor and adventure. The truth was erased, the blood was forgotten, the pain of the people who truly lived there, especially the Native Americans, immigrants, and poor laborers, was silenced. All that remained was the legend. The Wild West wasn't glamorous, it wasn't noble, it was harsh, it was filthy, and it was violent. The reality was simple. You didn't survive because you were brave. You survived because you were ruthless. And yet, the myth of the West lives on, a carefully constructed lie, hiding the darkness that really defined America's frontier. In the dark, lawless world of the Wild West, a new breed of men rose to power. Men who lived outside the law, who answered only to the gun, and whose names became legends whispered in fear. These were the outlaws, ruthless, cunning, and deadly. They were not heroes, they were not noble, they were predators, and their story is the bloodiest chapter of the frontier. Take Jesse James. Hollywood painted him as a Robin Hood, a man who stole from the rich and gave to the poor. But the truth? Jesse James was a cold-blooded killer. With his gang, he robbed trains, banks, and stagecoaches. Innocent civilians often died in the chaos of his raids. His so-called heroism was a myth. built by newspapers who romanticized his crimes to sell more stories. The reality was far darker. James lived by the gun, and every robbery left behind widows, orphans, and blood in the dirt. Then there was Billy the Kid, a name that echoes even today as the young outlaw who defied the law. The myth tells us of a daring teenager, quick on the draw, who fought bravely against corrupt authorities. But the truth? Billy the Kid killed at least 21 men before the age of 21. Some of them were criminals, but many were not. Billy was reckless, violent, and addicted to power. His life was not a heroic saga. It was a trail of broken bodies and shattered lives, ending in his own bloody death at just 21. And what about Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid? Hollywood gave us a story of charm, friendship, and daring escapes. But in reality, their gang, the Wild Bunch, was one of the most violent outlaw groups in American history. They terrorized entire regions, robbing banks, killing lawmen, and leaving chaos wherever they went. They weren't charming rogues. They were dangerous criminals, and their so-called adventures left behind nothing but fear and destruction. But perhaps the most chilling truth is this: the line between outlaw and lawman was often blurred. Some sheriffs and marshals were former criminals themselves. Others secretly worked with outlaw gangs, protecting them in exchange for money or favors. In the West, loyalty was bought, morality was flexible, and survival was the only law that mattered. The people who lived through this chaos didn't see outlaws as glamorous figures. They saw them as monsters, predators who could appear in the dead of night and take everything. So why then do we remember these men as legends? Why did their names live on while their victims' stories have been erased? The answer lies in the newspapers of the time. Journalists hungry for sales turned every outlaw into a larger-than-life figure. They gave them nicknames, exaggerated their deeds, and spun tales of adventure. Outlaws became celebrities, not because they deserved it, but because blood sold newspapers. And later, Hollywood carried the torch, turning ruthless killers into romantic anti-heroes. Their crimes were polished, their murders forgotten, and their legends immortalized. But strip away the myths, and you see them for what they truly were: men consumed by greed, violence, and bloodlust. Men who thrived in a land where law meant nothing, and death was always one pull of a trigger away. The rise of the outlaw wasn't about courage. It wasn't about rebellion. It was about survival, at any cost. And every story, every legend, every so-called hero of the frontier was built on the bodies of the innocent. The story of the Wild West is often told through the eyes of cowboys, sheriffs, and outlaws. But what about those who were here first? The people who had lived on this land for thousands of years, long before the frontier was even imagined. For the Native Americans, the Wild West was not a story of freedom and adventure. It was a nightmare of bloodshed, betrayal, and destruction. As white settlers pushed westward, hungry for land, gold, and opportunity, native tribes were forced from their homes. Entire nations were driven off their ancestral lands. Treaties were made, only to be broken. Promises were given, only to be betrayed. And when Native Americans resisted, the response was swift, brutal, and merciless. Take the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. Hundreds of Cheyenne and Arapaho people had set up camp under the promise of protection by the U.S. Army. They raised a white flag of peace above their village. But at dawn, American soldiers attacked anyway. They slaughtered over 200 people, most of them women and children. Victims were mutilated, bodies desecrated. The survivors fled into the snow, carrying the memory of that horror for generations. And yet, in history books, Sand Creek is often just a footnote. Or consider the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890. It began with fear of the ghost dance movement, a spiritual revival among native tribes who dreamed of reclaiming their land. The U.S. Army saw this as a threat. They surrounded a Lakota Sioux camp at Wounded Knee Creek. Tensions rose, a single gunshot rang out, and then chaos. Soldiers opened fire with rifles and Hotchkiss cannons, slaughtering more than 250 men, women, and children. The snow was stained red with blood. And that day, the dream of freedom for the Sioux people died in the cold. These were not battles, they were massacres, acts of violence against people who only wanted to live on their own land in peace. But in the eyes of the government and settlers, native lives were expendable, obstacles standing in the way of expansion. Entire cultures were erased, sacred lands stolen, children taken from their families and forced into boarding schools where their language, their traditions, and their identities were beaten out of them. For many Native Americans, survival itself became an act of resistance. Yet even in the face of horror, Native voices endured. Leaders like Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Geronimo fought to protect their people and their way of life. They became symbols of courage, though their resistance was met with overwhelming force. Sitting Bull was assassinated. Crazy Horse was betrayed and murdered. Geronimo, after years of resistance, was forced to surrender, living the rest of his life as a prisoner of war. These men weren't just warriors, they were guardians of their people, and their deaths marked the death of the free Native West. Think about this. The myths of the Wild West glorify cowboys and outlaws, but how often do they tell us about the women and children massacred at Sand Creek? About the Lakota families buried at Wounded Knee? About the tribes forced to walk the Trail of Tears, where thousands died from hunger, disease, and exhaustion? Their voices were silenced, their stories erased, their pain forgotten. But the truth cannot be buried forever. Every ghost town, every battlefield, every broken treaty carries their memory. The real story of the West is not just about outlaws and gunfighters. It's about the voices we lost. The Native Americans paid the highest price for the frontier dream. Their blood, their land, their lives built the foundation of the so-called Wild West. And if we are to tell the dark history of the West, their voices must be heard. When we think of Wild West towns, we imagine dusty main streets, swinging saloon doors, and brave sheriffs keeping order. Hollywood gave us towns full of charm, adventure, and danger. But danger that always felt exciting, almost romantic. The truth was far darker. The real boomtowns of the West weren't places of adventure. They were places of lawlessness, corruption, and blood. Towns where human life was cheap, and death lurked on every corner. Let's start with Deadwood, South Dakota. Born from a gold rush in the 1870s, Deadwood quickly became one of the most notorious towns in the frontier. Gambling, prostitution, and saloons dominated every street. Murder was so common, newspapers barely bothered to report it. It was here that Wild Bill Hickok, one of the most famous gunfighters of the West, was shot in the back while playing cards. His dead man's hand, aces and eights, became legendary. But his death wasn't an epic duel. It was a cowardly ambush in a smoky saloon, just one of hundreds of killings that stained Deadwood's history. Then there was Dodge City, Kansas, a town so violent it earned the nickname, the wickedest little city in America. Saloons and brothels lined the streets. Shootings were nightly events. Drunken cowboys flooded the town after long cattle drives, often leaving bodies in their wake. Dodge City wasn't cleaned up by lawmen, as the movies tell us. It was controlled by corruption. Sheriffs and marshals often took bribes from saloon owners, gamblers, and pimps. Justice was for sale, and if you couldn't pay, you were as good as dead. And who could forget Tombstone, Arizona? Hollywood turned it into the setting of one of the most famous stories of the West, the gunfight at the OK Corral. The legend tells us of brave lawmen Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and their fight for justice against a gang of outlaws. But the reality? That gunfight lasted barely 30 seconds. It wasn't a noble standoff. It was a messy street brawl, filled with confusion, fear, and blood. The Earps themselves were far from pure. They were gamblers, opportunists, and sometimes ruthless killers. In Tombstone, justice wasn't about right or wrong. It was about power. These towns weren't built on dreams. They were built on greed. Gold rushes and cattle drives created sudden explosions of people, but with no real law or structure. That vacuum was filled by crime, corruption, and bloodshed. Saloons became battlefields. Streets became killing grounds. Prostitutes were exploited, gamblers were cheated, and outsiders were easy prey. If you were new in town, chances were high you'd leave with nothing, or not leave at all. And the sheriffs, the marshals, they weren't heroes. Many lawmen were corrupt, drinking alongside the criminals they were supposed to fight. Some ran gambling dens themselves. Others enforced the law only when it suited their interests. In many cases, the line between criminal and lawman was invisible. Sometimes they were the same person. Life in these towns was short and brutal. Diseases spread quickly in crowded saloons and filthy streets. Violence was constant, and justice, when it came, was often swift and cruel. Public hangings were treated as entertainment. Crowds gathered to cheer as men swung from the gallows. Their deaths turned into spectacle. In the Wild West, death was not hidden. It was public. It was common. It was everywhere. The myth of the Wild West gave us towns of excitement, adventure, and rugged charm. But the truth was much darker. Deadwood, Dodge City, Tombstone, these weren't stories of honor and justice. They were stories of corruption, greed, and blood. To live in these towns was to live in fear. To walk down their streets was to gamble with your life. And for thousands, that gamble ended in death. Hollywood gave us the Wild West as a stage for legendary gunfights. Heroic duels fought under the burning sun, where men faced each other with honor, and the fastest draw always won. But the real gunfights of the West were not tales of honor. They were tales of chaos, drunken rage, betrayal, and blood. The so-called legends were often nothing more than murders glorified by newspapers and dime novels. Take the gunfight at the OK Corral, perhaps the most famous shootout in Western history. The legend tells us of Wyatt Earp, his brothers, and Doc Holliday standing tall against the Clanton-McClory gang in a heroic standoff. The reality? The fight lasted less than 30 seconds. 30 shots were fired in a frenzy of smoke and confusion. Witnesses couldn't even agree on what happened. 3 men were killed, and the Earps were put on trial for murder. This wasn't a clean-cut battle of good versus evil. It was a messy street brawl between rivals, and the so-called heroes, they were just as ruthless and flawed as the men they shot down. Another so-called legendary gunfight took place in El Paso, Texas in 1881, the 4 dead in 5 seconds shootout. It began when 2 cattle rustlers murdered a man. Constable Dallas Staudenmeyer rushed in, firing wildly. Within seconds, 4 men were dead, including an innocent bystander shot straight through the heart. There was no honor, no duel, no heroic moment, just a bloodbath in the middle of town. And then there was the Lincoln County War in New Mexico, a feud between rival businessmen that turned into a wave of bloodshed. Billy the Kid rose to infamy during this conflict, gunning down enemies in the streets. Newspapers turned him into a rebel hero, but in truth, he was part of a violent war driven not by justice, but by greed and revenge. Most gunfights weren't remembered because they weren't spectacular. They were drunken arguments in saloons, poker games gone wrong, or jealous disputes over women. Men drew their guns not at high noon, but in the dead of night or from the shadows. And more often than not, the victims weren't outlaws. They were ordinary people. Innocent men, women, and even children caught in the crossfire of reckless violence. But newspapers and dime novelists saw profit in blood. They exaggerated, twisted, and rewrote these chaotic killings into epic tales of bravery. Gunfighters were transformed into larger-than-life legends, men who lived by the gun and died by it. Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, Billy the Kid, their names became immortal, not because they fought for justice, but because blood sold papers, violence made legends. And the darker the story, the more people wanted to believe it. The truth is this: the famous gunfights of the West were not moments of courage. They were moments of desperation, greed, and rage. Every bullet fired left behind more than a corpse. It left behind families destroyed, lives shattered, and communities drowning in fear. The legends told us these gunfights built the myth of the West, but in reality, they only built one thing: graves. When people think of the Wild West, they imagine adventure, wide open skies, freedom, and opportunity. But for those who truly lived there, the frontier was not a dream. It was a battlefield for survival. Every day brought new dangers. Every choice could mean life or death. Let's start with the settlers, families who moved west, chasing the promise of land and wealth. They traveled thousands of miles in covered wagons, across deserts, mountains, and prairies. But the journey itself was deadly. Diseases like cholera, dysentery, and smallpox wiped out entire wagon trains. Rivers claimed wagons and children. Storms left people stranded without food or shelter. Many never even made it to the towns or lands they dreamed of. The West devoured them before they could ever begin. For those who did survive the journey, life was no easier. Settlers lived in crude cabins or dugouts made of dirt. Winters brought freezing cold and starvation. Summers brought drought, heat, and swarms of insects that destroyed crops. Hunger was constant. Families often went days without food. Children died from fevers, snake bites, and accidents. There were no hospitals, no doctors, just the harsh, unforgiving land and the will to endure it. Then there were the miners, men who rushed west chasing gold and silver. Hollywood painted them as lucky prospectors striking it rich with a single pickaxe. The reality was far darker. Most miners lived in filth, surrounded by disease, alcohol, and violence. Mines collapsed without warning, burying men alive. Poisonous gases suffocated others. Explosions ripped through tunnels, leaving bodies burned and broken. And those who did strike gold rarely kept it. Corrupt businessmen, banks, and swindlers stole their claims. For every miner who found fortune, thousands more died in poverty and despair. The cowboys, the symbol of the frontier, faced their own brutal reality. Days and nights spent in endless rides through rain, storms, and scorching heat. Injuries from stampedes and falls often meant death because medical help was miles away. They weren't romantic heroes. They were laborers, working for pennies, sleeping under the stars, eating beans and stale bread, and constantly at risk of attack from bandits, wild animals, and disease. Most never lived past their 30s. And for women, the frontier was even harsher. Settler women carried the weight of families, cooking, cleaning, raising children, farming, and often defending their homes alone when men were away. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death. With no proper medicine, many women and infants didn't survive. Others, forced into prostitution by poverty, lived short, tragic lives in saloons and brothels. Violence, abuse, and disease claimed them long before old age ever could. Death was everywhere in the Wild West. It came from disease, from hunger, from accidents, from bullets, from the land itself. Life expectancy was brutally short. For many, reaching the age of 40 was a miracle. But still, people came. They came for freedom, for opportunity, for the dream of building a new life. And in chasing that dream, countless lives were lost. The frontier did not forgive weakness. It demanded sacrifice. And for those who could not endure its brutality, the frontier swallowed them whole. The myth told us the West was a land of promise. The truth, it was a land of death. And behind every cowboy legend, every outlaw story, and every so-called triumph of progress were thousands of nameless graves, scattered across the desert, the mountains, and the plains. Forgotten lives, forgotten voices. Because in the Wild West, survival wasn't guaranteed. It was a privilege bought with blood. Today, the Wild West feels like a distant memory. But across America, if you look closely, you'll find towns frozen in time. Silent streets, empty saloons, rusted mine shafts, broken wooden signs swaying in the wind. They are called ghost towns. And behind their silence lies the echo of greed, violence, and death. Ghost towns were once booming settlements, born overnight during the gold and silver rushes. Thousands flooded in, miners, gamblers, saloon owners, outlaws. Money flowed, streets buzzed with life. But just as quickly as they rose, they died. When the mines ran dry, businesses collapsed. People left overnight, leaving behind homes, schools, and graves. What remains today are empty shells of towns that once burned with chaos and desperation. Take Bodie, California, one of the most infamous ghost towns. In the late 1800s, Bodie was a gold mining town filled with saloons, gunfights, and crime. Murder was so common that residents joked, "Goodbye, God, we are going to Bodie." Today, Bodie is preserved in a state of arrested decay. Visitors claim they feel watched, followed. Some swear they hear footsteps in the empty streets, laughter from abandoned saloons, or gunshots echoing across the desert night. And there's a curse. Locals believe if you steal anything from Bodie, even a single rock, Misfortune will follow you until you return it. Then there's Tombstone, Arizona, a town famous for the OK Corral gunfight. Tourists see staged shows and gift shops, but beneath the surface lies a darker truth. In the 1880s, Tombstone's Boot Hill Cemetery filled with murder victims, suicides, and outlaws gunned down in the street. Visitors claim to see shadowy figures walking among the graves. Some say they've seen the restless spirits of those who died violently, still searching for peace. Deadwood, South Dakota, once ruled by gamblers and gunfighters. This is where Wild Bill Hickok was shot in the back of the head during a poker game, holding the now infamous Dead Man's Hand. Even today, visitors claim his ghost lingers in Deadwood, alongside the souls of miners, outlaws, and prostitutes who met violent ends in the lawless streets. And then there are the countless other towns, Bannock, Nevada City, Jerome, Calico, places that thrived on greed and collapsed into silence. Legends say many of these towns are cursed, that the men who died in mines still scream underground, that women murdered in brothels still cry out at night, that outlaw ghosts still walk the dusty streets, waiting for another duel that will never come. The ghost towns of the Wild West are more than tourist attractions. They are graveyards of ambition, greed, and blood. Every broken building, every empty saloon, every lonely grave is a reminder that the West was not one with dreams. It was built on suffering. And if you walk those streets at night, listen closely. You might just hear the voices of the past, the voices of the forgotten, because the Wild West may be dead, but its ghosts are very much alive. The Wild West did not last forever. By the late 1800s, the frontier began to die. Railroads stretched across the land, telegraphs carried news in seconds, and the U.S. government declared the frontier officially closed in 1890. But what truly ended the Wild West was not progress alone. It was the destruction of the myths. Hollywood and dime novels told us the West was built by brave cowboys, noble sheriffs, and fearless outlaws. But the truth? The real West was built on greed, blood, and suffering. Cowboys were not heroes. They were underpaid laborers. Sheriffs were not symbols of justice. Many were corrupt, working for whoever paid them more. And outlaws? Most were not charming rebels. They were violent, desperate men who murdered for survival or revenge. Narrator, somber tone. Native Americans whose lands were stolen, whose cultures were destroyed, were erased from the heroic tales. Their suffering was silenced. The genocide they endured was buried under stories of cowboy triumphs. Women who carried the weight of families, built communities, and often died in childbirth were written out of the myth entirely. In Hollywood, they became background characters, when in reality, they were the backbone of survival. The railroad tycoons and businessmen who truly shaped the West were rarely celebrated. Instead, the myth focused on gunfights, duels, and legends, because blood sold more stories than truth. By the 20th century, the Wild West had become entertainment. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show toured the world, turning violent history into spectacle. Hollywood turned ruthless outlaws into folk heroes. Children grew up playing cowboys and Indians, never knowing the real horror behind those games. But beneath the myths, the graves remain. Millions suffered and died to build the frontier. Their voices silenced, their stories forgotten. And yet, in the silence of ghost towns, in the faded photographs, in the unmarked graves scattered across the desert, the truth still lingers. The West was not won by honor. It was not won by heroes. It was won by violence, by blood, by death. The myth of the Wild West will live forever on movie screens. But the reality, the dark, untold truth, is far more haunting And that is the story they never wanted you to know.